Friends, welcome to the March edition of the Virtual Book Club offered by South Carolinians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty and the South Carolina Christian Action Council. We hope that you have brought your favorite beverage. I brought a water bottle and also a mug of passion tea brought to you by Tazo. I hope that they will sponsor us. That would be very lovely. And tonight I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming everybody for a book discussion on Danielle Sered's Until We Reckon. This is a fantastic book. You did not have to read it in order to participate in this discussion, but man, are you missing out if you have not read it. And our conversation partner tonight is somebody who actually works with Danielle Sered. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to participate with us, but we have Stephan Thomas, and let me introduce him very quickly. He was kind enough to provide a lovely biography for all of us. Stephan Thomas is the Director of Partnerships and Replication at Common Justice, which is an organization that advocates solutions to violence that transform the lives of those harmed and foster racial equity without relying on incarceration. Stephan is a former Senior King County Prosecutor in the state of Washington and a national expert on leveraging the power of the prosecutor to implement alternatives to incarceration that hold people accountable for harm, break cycles of violence, and secure safety, healing, and justice for survivors and their communities. Stephan's expertise is born out of his lived experience growing up on the south side of Chicago, where he learned firsthand that privilege and opportunity could enable him to overcome his childhood trauma. In his spare time, Stephan enjoys exploring new places with his wife, Angeline, and their 7-year-old son, Xavier. He has been to 35 countries, every continent except for Antarctica. Stephan is also a leadership coach, an avid reader, and enjoys meditation, hiking, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and cooking. Friends in the Virtual Book Club, please welcome Stephan Thomas.
Thank you. Such a warm welcome. I appreciate that, Hillary. I'm going to toss it to you because we have some questions, and so I'm going to let you field some questions, and then we can kind of go from there.
Absolutely. So, because this, we've heard a little bit about your bio, but tell us a little bit about Common Justice, the organization that Danielle Sered has sort of, launched this book from. Tell me your experience with them and kind of how you came to be there, what it's like.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Being in South Carolina, even virtually, really warms my heart because my paternal grandmother is from Greenville, South Carolina, and she is what is known as an upland Geechee, if you all are familiar with that term. And if you know, the Gullah Geechee people are really deeply steeped in restorative justice practices and principles. And so this idea about restorative justice really is like baked into my DNA. And not just mine, but like me and Danielle would say, like, it's really something that's universal to us as people, that we want to heal and restore harm. And these practices feel really, really innate to us versus the things that we have right now in this carceral system feel very foreign because they separate and they cause more harm than they do good. So the way that I came to this work is first through my parents. My parents were activists and organizers, and they met and fell in love and moved to the south side of Chicago so they could do community organizing. And they had me. I'm an only child. My dad is Black, my mom is white. And my dad, he's an amazing, strong Black man. He's dead now. But when I was younger, he was one way out in the community, but he was something different at home. And when he was at home, he was very, very abusive, both physically and verbally to me. And his idea was that, life is really hard for Black people. And so I need to break you down so that I can build you back up. And that did not work. And when he left my family when I was 8 years old, I thought that it had something to do with me. I felt like he left because it was my fault. And he moved to Oakland, California, and my mom stayed on the south side of Chicago, and she raised me. And I did a lot of things over the ensuing 10 years after my dad left that I'm not really proud of. I caused a lot of harm I was harmed myself. And a lot of it was me searching for identity and belonging in every single place that I could find it. And that led me to be in the highways and the byways, so to speak. And so when I was 18, I went to move with my dad. And at that time, my dad had grown and evolved a lot. And he made the decision that we needed to reconcile. And so for a 6-month period of time, we went through a process with another party where we met and we talked through our issues. And I was able to hear, he was able to hear from me how him leaving me impacted me, how his abuse impacted me, the decisions that I made as a result of that. And I was able to hear from him what it was like growing up in Augusta, Georgia, with a dad who had been incarcerated and a mom who was an alcoholic. And that period of time, like that thing that we went through, I didn't know it at the time, but that's restorative justice, right? It's us being able to sit down and dialogue and come to some agreements about how we could heal the harm that he had caused to me. Him taking ownership and responsibility and accountability, him being willing to hold my anger. And so I had this real deep experience with this thing called restorative justice from a young age. And then that process I went through was really transformative for me. Before that time, I was smoking weed and drinking alcohol and popping pills just to put myself to sleep every night because of all the things that I had witnessed on the South Side of Chicago. And so from there, I got clean, I got sober, I went to college, I ended up going to law school. And when I went to law school, I made the decision that I was going to be a DA. And I did that because if you all don't know, the DA is the most powerful actor in the criminal justice system. They are the ones who make the decision about whether or not to charge someone with the death penalty or not. It is in their sole discretion of that DA to make that decision. And so I said to myself, man, I want to be in that seat of power, and I want to be able to be the one who holds the decision-making power on some of these really, really heavy topics that we're talking about. And what I learned very, very quickly working within the DA's office is that a racist system is going to produce racist outcomes, no matter how moral, the individual actors are within that system. And what was needed is more options. And so that pushed me to find out what are the options that are out there and how do we look beyond, right? Because what I was doing was like more or less punishment. I could be a nicer punisher, but there was no other alternative other than being steeped in this punishment system. And so as I searched for alternatives, that led me to this organization in Brooklyn called Common Justice. And Common Justice for now going on 15 years has been running an alternative to prison that is steeped in restorative justice. The end goal of Common Justice is really to eradicate violence. And this is just one strategy that we have chosen in order to eradicate violence, because we know that one of the main drivers of violence in our community is incarceration. And so because we are so pro-anti-violence, we are also pro-anti-incarceration, because we know that there's oftentimes a corollary between those two. And Common Justice works with both what we call harm parties, or you might call them defendants or offenders, but those seem really derogatory words, and they seem to identify people. That's who you always are. But people who cause harm is the word that we say. And then the other word for folks who've been harmed, we call them the harm party. So, it's the responsible party, and the harm party. That's what I meant to say. The responsible party and the harm party. So responsible party is the person who's caused harm. Harm party is the person who's been harmed. And we provide services to both. We are a survivor-centered organization. So that means that we give survivors the opportunity to consent to this process or not. So they don't have to participate. And even if they say they don't consent to the process, they don't want the responsible party to go through this process, we still will provide them with supportive services, irregardless of whether or not they participate in the process or not. After a period of time that the responsible party is going through a really in-depth a violence intervention curriculum. We bring them together, the responsible party and the harmed party, we bring them together for a restorative dialogue where the harmed party is able to express, feelings of anger or questions and curiosity that they have, frustration that they have. Why did you do this? Why me? What was going on with you at the time? And they're able to hold that conversation in a really, really good way and find some agreements that both parties can agree on and how they can heal the harm. Then the responsible party is given a period of time. This process usually takes about 12 to 15 months, our total kind of restorative process. After about another 9 months or so, they're given an opportunity to fulfill those agreements. And once those agreements are fulfilled, the case against them is dismissed or reduced down to a misdemeanor. And we only work with individuals who've been charged with serious violent offenses. So your robberies, your assaults, your home invasion robberies, right? We don't do like lower level offenses. Like our process is too intense for it to be for, say, for example, for a shoplift. Like the reason why our process is so intense is because that's what it takes to really transform violence. Our program has been hugely successful. 90% of the survivors who we offer common justice to, they choose this process. Since 2000 and since our process was finalized, kind of the model that we have finalized in 2012, we've only had one person go out and one graduate commit another violent offense, and that was at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. Only 7% of our participants have been terminated for committing a new crime. Like you can't find a prison in the whole entire world who can produce those types of results. And it just goes to show that what we're doing works better than the traditional process. So that's my story, and that's common justice.
I think that that's an amazing story. Now, speaking of common justice, you told me the other day that you have read Until We Reckon more times than perhaps most people ever will. And so I am curious, because this is a book club, because we're focusing on this, what is your favorite part? You can share page numbers for those of us who are nerds about this book. Those of us who are waiting to be nerds about this book. Yeah. I certainly have my favorite parts, and I'm happy to share those, but I really want to hear what you love about this book and what you love about this work.
Yeah, I've got my book right here, and I was just thumbing through it. There's a lot in here to really unpack, right? I mean, first is the framing, right, of how we're talking about violence. So I think the first few chapters, even in the introduction, right, to expose the fallacy that prison actually works in any way, right? But not just that it doesn't work, but the flip side, that it's actually a driver of crime. I love the part in the book where Danielle talks about the core drivers of violence being shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. And then the core features of prison are shame, violence, right? Exposure to violence, isolation, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. And so the very strategy that we have to combat violence actually has baked into it the very things that produce violence. And I couldn't think of anything that was more wilder than that. And that really kind of exposed, the myth that prison does anything that in any fundamental way really keeps us safe. I think the other things that really struck home with me are conversations about accountability. So oftentimes we conflate punishment with accountability and say if someone has been punished and they've been held accountable. Well, I mean, I was a DA, I will tell you firsthand that there is a big difference between the two. Like I've seen people come time and time and time again who are willing to be punished, but who have never been held accountable. They've never really held accountable because accountability is not really something that you can do from the outside. Really, it's something that has to come internally. Punishment is passive, Danielle talks about in the book, where accountability is really more about doing sorry, right? It's about taking responsibility. It's about acknowledging the harm that you've caused, being willing to go through a process to repair the harm, and then being the type of person who will never cause that harm again. Like prison doesn't require you to do that at all. Like prison, you can literally go to prison, right? I've was a prosecutor. I've also been a defense attorney as well. You know, and the first thing that you tell your client as a defense attorney is like, shut up, don't say anything. I'm going to do all of the talking for you. And it doesn't matter what you've done, plead not guilty to this case. We're going to fight it to the death, right? Like that's the kind of the mentality that, you know, I have as a defense attorney, which rightfully so, right? Like the state has to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. But the whole goal is I'm trying to avoid you from facing any harsh punishment. But a lot of times people want to be accountable. They're like, but I actually did do it. Like I actually did cause this kind of harm, or I caused the harm, but maybe not to the extent that the state is saying that I did, but I want to be able to admit something, but they can't. And so then they get caught in this cycle, right? Where they're trying to do everything that they can to avoid being punished, but they're not really actually willing to be held accountable. The other part of the book that I think is really, really amazing is the conversation about survivors and what do survivors really want? Because like the death penalty really thrives off of these stories that this is what the survivor's family is really longing and calling for. And this is what justice means. And the reality is that what survivors want is so much more complex than that. Of course, we know that there are survivors out there who say, I want the death penalty. I want the maximum sentence. Like those are the voices that get lifted up. And those are the people that we really we hear from and who they make these laws about. But the reality is that that's a small percentage of who actually is a survivor. Survivors come in all types of shapes, sizes, and color, and what they want look differently. And even for those survivors who want punishment, it's usually punishment or nothing. And no one, when your loved one has been harmed, wants nothing to happen. And so if punishment's the only thing that you're going to be given, well, then I want that as maximum amount of that as possible. And so that's what folks are really, really longing for, right? They're longing for answers and options, and all we're giving to them is this one blunt tool of incarceration. And so just understanding what survivors want, right? They want answers. They want validation. They want their voices to be heard. They want some control relative to what happened. They want resources to actually heal and to feel safe. And that's not what our current process does. And so I think like really taking ownership over, and I love that the book does this, it takes ownership over the fact that actually mass incarceration does harm to crime survivors. And so it takes one of the biggest and best arguments that advocates for the death penalty and for heavy sentences have. It really flips that on its head and says, no, in fact, what's best for survivors is things like alternatives to incarceration, therapy, healing, services, support, stability. Like those are the things that actually makes a difference. Then I'll end with this, because it doesn't matter. We can have all these nice concepts, but it doesn't matter if there's no policy changes. And so the conversation around policy and power is where the rubber meets the road, where we could talk about practical ways to really transform, dismantle our system, and then build something new in its place. Because at the end of the day, like this is not just about not doing something. Like if someone's loved one has been murdered, it's not that we're just going to say, oh, well, you know, sorry that happened. No, there needs to be robust processes for repairing and healing that harm. And we need to build them because they don't exist to the extent that they should.
All of the above, absolutely. And what you were saying about accountability and victims, I love the metaphor that she uses about imagining, victim services as we currently know them as like a hamburger joint that's like not actually very good in the middle of nowhere. And there are people who go to this joint because they're told like, this is the only thing you can get for miles and miles. Yeah. And there are way more people. And she reports that more than 50% of people who are victims of violent crime don't report those violent crimes to the police. Over 50% of people in this country zoom past those services because they know that there's nothing good that is going to come from involvement from our law enforcement, our carceral system. And that was just such an incredible, powerful metaphor. And she does the same thing with solitary confinement, I think, and talking about treatment from doctors. You know, we don't just prescribe isolation as a way to cure a common cold or a terrible virus. And I thought that was particularly amazing, sort of post-COVID, right? This book was written and published before COVID even happened. So, I mean, just a sucker punching metaphors, amazing.
Well, it's something that people don't know about Danielle is that she went to school to be a poet. So she's actually a poet, is her background. She's not a lawyer, she's a poet. So anyway, yeah, I think some of those metaphors come into play.
I'm sure that makes total sense.
Sure.
So you've alluded to, you know, policy changes as an important part of fixing the violence in our country. And Danielle Sered says that the death penalty, abolishing the death penalty rather, is the first step to addressing the violence in our country. And I'm looking to page 159 for those of you who have the hardback version of this. And she says, for whatever reasons we reject the use of capital punishment, a criminal justice system that opposes violence cannot have killing as its maximum penalty and still achieve its aims. So I'm curious, does your experience as a prosecutor align with this? I think you've alluded to this already, but I want an official answer from you.
I mean, yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, it does. I mean, I think this notion that we're going to heal harm by causing more harm, like fundamentally doesn't make sense, right? It's like that is only going to produce more, you know, and I think, you know, I think these comes back to like concepts that we know for folks who are people of faith, right? These are the things that Dr. King talked about fundamentally, right? That hate is going to produce more hate, harm is going to produce more harm. And so I think when we think about the fallacy that the death penalty somehow deters people or keeps us safe, or like no one is thinking about the trigger, like, I think I'm gonna, like, I might get the death penalty if I do this. Like if you are going down that road, you are not contemplating what the punishment is going to be. So it has really, really little deterrent effect. And I think that has been, you know, really, really proven. I mean, that's like, there's been a ton of research that has been done about that. So I think I'm going to expand on what Danielle said. I feel like a lot of the first steps, right, before we get to like the policy changes, was why that conversation comes later in the book, is a lot of the narrative changes that need to happen on the front end, right? The conversations and these kind of myths and these tropes that we have about violence and what keeps us safe, like those are some of the things that we have to begin to address. Like that is the soil by which we can have conversations around transforming some of these tools of this carceral system, right? But I feel like if you're going to have, once you've kind of sown those seeds and you're looking for a strategy of where to go from there, like the death penalty really is one that has no moral backing at all, and really is a great place where you can get a lot of agreement on, right? And as a, like just practical strategy, pragmatic strategy of like where to put your time and energy into, like this is an amazing place. One, because there's been so many states around the country, right, who don't have the death penalty, who actually have lower murder rates than they do for states that do have the death penalty. It's somehow interesting that the states, a lot of them in the South, not exclusively, a lot of them in the South that do have the death penalty also have the highest homicide rates. Places in the Northeast that don't have, that have lower rates of the death penalty, also have a lower homicide rates. Now, I'm not saying that there's a corollary between the two, but it definitely speaks to the fact that the more people that the state is killing does not necessarily mean that that is keeping us safe. And so for you all, just wanted to give you some encouragement that you are like right in the right place, like have your finger, you're on the right pulse, and that you are pressing on the right issue. Because once this allows us to have conversations around safety, what really keeps us safe, what are the policy changes that we need to put our time, money, and effort into first. So, yeah.
And then I have one more question, and then I'll turn it over to those who are with us gathered here tonight. How would you use restorative justice with those who are impacted by the death penalty? I think that's a big question that a lot of people have, is like, well, what alternatives are there to the death penalty? And certainly there are some alternatives that we would prefer than others. That's not our place to litigate, though. Right now, we're in a place of saying any alternative is better than the death penalty. But certainly Danielle Sered makes a really big case for restorative justice, and we'll be covering Howard Zer's little book of restorative justice later on in the year. So I'm excited for that. But briefly, tell us, how would you use restorative justice for people who are system impacted?
For sure. So I've had the opportunity as a defense attorney to have clients who committed murder and to represent them on resentencings and on clemency hearings. And so these are like, 20, 30 years after an offense has taken place. And the thing that always shocks me is that when survivors show up to testify, that oftentimes it is if the event just happened yesterday, which leads me to believe that they really have not been given the tools or the opportunity really to heal. Right. And it really has not gotten into the root of the grief. Right. I like a line that Danielle has in her book where she talks about the death penalty as being grieving by punishment. And that's a really powerful line for me. Right. You're grieving by punishment. And the way that you are keeping or handling and processing your grief is by pumping it all into this kind of punishment apparatus. Restorative justice allows you to begin to have a real process for survivors really to be able to walk through the pain that they have experienced in a really, really good way. And there's a lot of ways that you can set this up, right? I mean, survivors should have opportunities to do this irregardless of what happens with the ultimate outcome of a case. It should just be normalized that we provide survivors with everything that they need to heal, right? From housing to therapy, to help with education, to trauma support, like all of those things should be in place. And right now, like that just does not exist. Like as a prosecutor, I will tell you that survivors often get used as just tools of your case, right? They're like pawns for your case. And that's really about it. And a lot of victim services are about facilitating them coming to court and testifying, not actually about helping them to heal. So when you have quote unquote victim advocates, those are really people who are only there if the survivor chooses to participate in the legal process. And they're really only there to facilitate them coming to court and testifying and to being with them throughout that process. It's an important role, but it's not the role that is needed to actually produce really, really deep healing. So I'm about healing, and if you're a person of faith, then you should also be about healing and restoration and reconciliation. Like those are core fundamentals of the Christian faith. And so when I think about restorative justice as applied to the death, as an alternative to the death penalty, I think about it as what's going to really produce the maximum amount of healing. And I think the research has shown just through the satisfaction that survivors have through going through this process, right? Overwhelmingly, the post surveys of survivors after they've gone through a restorative process shows that this is far more satisfying than an experience with the criminal justice system. And so first of all, it's going to provide more healing for survivors. I mean, I think that's really, really clear. Secondly, does it provide opportunities for transformation? One of the things that I have also with one of my clients who was in prison for murder, got to go through a restorative process while they were in prison. It was a restorative process, not with the victim themselves, but with a surrogate, meaning someone who stood in the place of the victim. And the reason why is because there's all types of rules and laws in a lot of places that prevent those who've caused harm and the people who have been harmed from being able to be together in one room. And so they used a surrogate, and he was able to walk through his actions, where he was at that time. He was really able to answer some really tough questions about what he really went through. He was able to actually, apologize to someone and take ownership over what happened, and then commit himself to being the type of person who would never cause that harm again. Extremely transformative for him, so much so that he was able to get clemency and is out in prison now. And one of the things that helped was the fact that he was willing to take responsibility over his actions for harming someone. And so when you think about a process, right, that is going to provide healing on both sides, like this is the thing that has been tried and tested and true that we know works right now. What doesn't produce the same results is killing people. Like that absolutely does not heal harm on either side. I will end with this. Like the thing that I think troubles me so much about the death penalty is that it treats people as they're unredeemable. Like they have no opportunity for a second chance, that they are the worst thing that they've ever done in their life. And restorative justice treats people with an extreme amount of dignity on both sides. That you can move beyond this pain, you can move beyond this harm that you've caused to evolve and to be a person who can actually make a difference in the lives of other people. I am amazed. I've spent a lot of time in prisons all over the country, and the people who are in prison, there are remarkable, amazing people who are in prison right now for these extremely long sentences, who did something when they were 17 and 18. Now they're 45 and 50, who are the kindest, gentlest people that you would ever meet. But yet they are forever characterized as these irredeemable people who are so dangerous that we have to keep them locked up. So restorative justice is not the what's the word that I'm trying? It's not the answer for everything. It's not the end all be all. It is one strategy amongst many that we need to have. And so I don't want to say that RJ is the thing. It is one thing that we need to have, a menu of options that are available to us. And so we need to be building and working towards this, not because it's the only answer, but because it is an answer amongst many other things that we need, right? We need better education, better mental health court, right? We need better way that we're addressing drug addiction, better ways that we're addressing child welfare, and so on and so forth. Better ways of addressing the root causes of violence. Like those are all the things that we need to be working towards. Restorative justice just being one of them.
Thank you for that amazing answer. Those are all the questions that I have. And so now I turn it over to those who are gathered here for any questions they may have about common justice or about Danielle's book. Sister Pam.
I think one of the things that I found really helpful, and you certainly pointed to it, was the whole issue of accountability, and the way in which she outlined was kind of 5 basic steps that would have to be taken, which included acknowledging the harm that's done. And in many ways, it kind of reminded me of the 12-step program too, that you have to kind of face up to what you've done. You have to face people that were affected by it, et cetera, et cetera. But, one of the things I kept bumping into, though, was all these stories of people who were in high crime areas, who were victims or in a few cases perpetrators. And the whole theme that Hillary pointed out about not willing to report because of no faith in the system and not feeling that the system would bring any safety or closure or improvement or anything. And I just was wondering if when common justice has dealt with individuals, have you had a high number of people who were involved in unreported crimes, or do you get people referred to you primarily by people who have been charged with something?
Yeah, no, that's great. This just goes back to what I was saying before. Like, we need a lot of different strategies, right? And so one of the strategies needs to be for restorative processes, or what's often called transformative justice processes, for people who don't want to have any involvement with the system, right? Like, they don't want to report. So that needs to be like totally, completely within community, these are the ways that we dealt with things like when the neighborhood I was growing up in, right? When I did something wrong, it was like Brown who lived down the street, like who got the kids together and say, hey, y'all need to squash this beef. Like that was how we dealt with things without resorting to calling 911. So there needs to be, processes and places and communities where we can heal harm without having to resort to calling 911. And in a lot of jurisdictions, they have places like, violence interrupters and peacemakers and so on and so forth who are doing that kind of work. What Common Justice does is we take the slice of folks who have been involved within the system, right? Like someone has been arrested, they have been charged with a crime, like they're headed towards the pathway to prison. So that's kind of our lane, right? It's one strategy, many are needed, but our lane is an alternative to prison. So we're kind of like that last stop, like this person's headed towards prison. They've been charged with a crime, but instead of that, they're given an opportunity to participate in our process. And so that's kind of where that's our lane that we fill. And like I say, there's so much, there's the prevention, the deflection, the diversion. There's a lot of different buckets that need to be filled. All of those strategies are all valid. Like not one should be pitted against the other. Like we need to have them all, right? Because law enforcement has all their different types of units. They got the SWAT team, right? They got the ACT team, they got the drug team, they got all these different teams. They have all their different strategies. Well, we need to have the same in community, right? Where we have a lot of different off-ramps for folks who find themselves involved in violence.
Yeah, thank you.
And can you say a little bit more about your role? How big an organization is this? I didn't do my homework. I'm looking at Common Justice and who funds you. And I know you've been around 15 years, right? You said, but you're muted.
Yeah, we have a staff of about 30 to 40 folks, it fluctuates from time to time. And funded mostly by private philanthropy. We don't take any money from the district attorney. We do have a partnership in Brooklyn. And there was another question. And my particular, so my role is really unique at Common Justice. For the last 15 years, our primary focus has been in expanding our work in Brooklyn, Manhattan, and in the Bronx. And my role is more national in focus. And so I provide support to other jurisdictions outside of New York who want to build a similar intervention to the one that we have. And so we have partnerships with community-based organizations around the country who are building a similar common justice style restorative process in their community. So places like Jackson, Mississippi, Nashville, Tennessee, St. Louis, Missouri. Those are a few of the places where we have ongoing work at right now. Our goal is not to franchise Common Justice. Our goal is to support folks who are already on the ground doing the work. But we recognize that we've made a ton of mistakes over the years and learned some lessons and have some wisdom. And so we provide training and technical assistance to other jurisdictions who are looking to do the same. I mean, for years, Common Justice was like the only organization doing this type of work. And we're so proud that we can say that we're no longer the only ones who are doing that type of work. And we can begin the process of eradicating our uniqueness so that it's just the norm. Like should be an option wherever you're at. It's baked into our process, into our culture, so that it's normalized. And right now it's still exceptional, and I don't want it to be exceptional anymore.
Thank you.
I do have another question. I don't remember which chapter it was in, but at one point, Danielle had been talking so much about the alternatives to incarceration, but at one point, she simply said, there are some people from whom society needs to be protected. And I'm assuming that she was thinking of the serial killer, the truly mentally ill person. And I at one point lived near a place that was providing care for what they called criminally insane teens. And I just wonder how you deal with people who may not really seem to be capable of some restoration, rehabilitation, reintegration into society. How do you handle that?
Yeah, I mean, first I think one of the problems is that who those people are who can't be reintegrated, who can't evolve, right? Right now, the numbers of who we think those people are like humongous. Like it's a lot of people. And I think the reality is that people who may be like mentally ill and sociopaths, such a really small percentage of our population, right? And if we just get to the place where we were back around the time when I was born, like in 1970s, if we just cut our prison population in half, if we stopped trying to be, stop this record of being the world's #1 jailer and incarcerator, right? If we just got to the place where we could half our prison population, like if we can do that in my lifetime, we have done a tremendous amount of good for our society, right? And so I think those are the types of goals that we should be aiming for, right? We always don't want to build policy on the exceptional cases, which is what we do right now. It's like the Jeffrey Dahmers of the world. Like those are the people who we build this whole incarceration system for. Like there's a very few amount of, John Wayne Gacy's and, Jeffrey Dahmers, like those are not the norm, right? So I think that's one. And I think there's also, and I'm not saying that these folks cannot evolve, but I just want to name that common justice doesn't do work with folks who've committed sexual violence, people who've abused children. And that, not to say that it wouldn't be appropriate for it, it's just a different type of harm and one that we're not equipped necessarily to deal with. And so we recognize, again, like there has to be a lot of different strategies. That's one. Like, how do you deal with domestic violence and sexual violence in a way that's healing and restoring, other than resorting to incarceration? There's a lot of questions that we don't have the answers to, right? We don't necessarily know how to deal with that. But when it comes to the types of violence, right? Robberies, assaults, quote unquote, street violence that we think of that, like that's our area of expertise. And oftentimes, like those are the people who are filling up our jail cells right now. And so we know there's an answer to that. So let's focus on, let's focus our attention on that and not get distracted by the 1%, right? Or the half of 1%, 0.5% of people out there who are the Jeffrey Dahmers of the world.
I think you also make a really good point too, Stephan, of, this is our lane, we focus on assaults and violence around like theft and robbery. And, I did work with a domestic violence shelter years ago. And I remember talking with one of the counselors who said, yeah, there aren't a lot of good strategies right now on like prevention for this kind of work for people who cause harm in this way. And in the book, Until We Reckon, Danielle says, imagine all the things we could do, if we had the moral imagination, and we can have the moral imagination if we stop investing in the system that doesn't work. So this is about reprioritizing to focus on effectiveness and efficiency, and also creating new and better ways to heal people instead of just treating the present ways as the only solution forever and ever. Amen. Because at one point, the things that we do know heal people, they were not being used. They were brand new and they were untested and they were just case studies, and now they're evidence-based. And so it presumes that there are other things that are brand new or maybe just on the precipice of being invented, And they will need case studies, but they too can become evidence-based ways of intervention and healing for people.
Beautiful. So well said.
Just to tag on to what Hillary said, I think, when she talks about our not having the moral imagination to come up with these multiple strategies, but I think what really helps to kind of pique the moral imagination is many of the stories. So many of the stories that put a face on the people who were involved in crimes, people who were survivors, people who were charged with crimes, and hearing the story of a girl who was abused by her father, but wouldn't tell anybody because she was afraid her mother would be deported, or the Daquan who has somebody pull a gun on him, and then the officer asks him, well, where's your gun? Presuming that somehow he instigated it. There were so many stories, though, that put a face on kind of what the reality of these urban situations especially seemed.
Yeah, when I was I left the DA's office, I worked for another organization where we trained prosecutors. And one of the things that we found in our research is that prosecutors lack empathy for people who come into the system. And so we worked with a design firm in San Francisco to design empathy building exercises. And one of the exercises that we designed was a visit to sit and circle with incarcerated people in prison. And so we would take prosecutors to prison to actually meet people who were serving life sentences and extremely long sentences so that we could put a face, right?
Yeah.
So I could actually understand the humanity and the whole story. And a lot of times, folks in those circles were not sharing about their experiences causing harm, but their experiences as survivors, right? And so they were sharing stories about, my first experience with violence was not causing it, but actually being a victim. Like I was one who was sexually assaulted when I was a young kid, and no one was there for me. And that's what started the spiral for me. I grew up in a home with domestic violence. No one intervened for me. No one provided me with any support. And like when they hear these stories and they start building these relationships with folks on the inside, it begins to shift their mindset about who these people are. And they no longer become the monsters and the animals that they came into those places thinking that they were. They're like, my God, these are some amazing and remarkable people. And had they been this tables turned, like I would have been the prosecutor who was, on their case, supporting them as a victim. You know what I mean? And so that really like helping people to build empathy and to understand, other folks' life experiences that they may not have experienced themselves is really, really powerful. And one strategy, right, for really helping people to shift their mindset around some of these issues.
Are there any other questions that people want to bring to Stephan or to the group?
I've had a lot of experiences recently. I've gotten pushback from people when I am involved with either religious services or presentations or some about racism and combating racism, confronting racism. So I'm assuming that you get a lot of that too, because certainly a major theme of the book is the inequities that drive some of the violence and then how it gets perpetuated generation after generation. But I mean, just yesterday, I got this long email from a retired man who lives near Hilton Head who was criticizing my involvement with some of the racial justice matters. And, I kind of basically said, I'm just tired of hearing about this all the time. Do you get that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, I think, especially right now, I think that there are folks within this country who are weaponizing anti-racism, right? I mean, and what I mean by they are weaponizing the people who are anti-woke and anti-CRT. I mean, it's being weaponized right now, right? So that means that people's lived experiences then are being disregarded. And I think there is this fatigue that people are feeling at this moment in time around these issues. And I think that's by design, right? Because if you're fatigued, then you don't want to do the work that it's going to take. And it is going to take work to really dismantle some of these systems. And I also want to note, like, while the stories of like individual racism are like real and, they happen, like it's much more from a systemic standpoint, right? Like the inequities that are baked in, the fact that, I grew up in a community where my education system is funded by property taxes. Those property taxes are not as much as the property taxes that are in the suburbs. And so I get subpar education. When I get subpar education, I'm not going to get the same opportunities moving forward, right? I also live in a community that is overly policed versus other communities, right? And so I'm more likely to have contact with law enforcement. And so I might get picked up on something and arrested for something that someone else might not have the same experience. Like I went to college. There's a lot of people on college campuses who are smoking weed, committing sexual assault, stealing from people, so on and so forth. But those college campuses are not overly policed the same way that Black and brown communities are. And so I say all that to say that I think, the individual racism real, and we need to address that. But most people are today I don't know, they're sophisticated enough that they're not going to say the thing, but they will support the policy, right? They will support the death penalty, even though it disproportionately impacts Black people, and not see the connection between that support and our history and legacy of racism within our country. The fact that it's the Southern United States, where slavery was rooted and grounded, it also has the highest incarceration rates. And people don't see the connection between those two. And I think helping people to make those connections, I think, is really, really, really important.
You bring up an important piece, Stephan, and it's connected to the fact that the death penalty movement has not always made a connection between racism and the death penalty. And that is something that the movement is working very, very hard to redirect and correct. And I've been really grateful for a lot of that modeling so that SCADP can follow that. We have one question. Let's see here. There's a person who's asking if they can have my email address because they want to send me a local and successful example of restorative justice in Tallahassee. Yes, please. We're always in need of really cool things and restorative justice organizations in the Southeast. We are thrilled that you are joining us. I'm guessing from Tallahassee. And I hope that we can also connect you with some of the things that are starting to form in South Carolina. So 2 quick kind of initiatives I want to share because time is running out. We have the South Carolina Restorative Justice Initiative, which is within the University of South Carolina School of Law. And that is run by a professor and an assistant. And they do really cool things. They do workshops, they hold seminars, they do lectures. So I invite you to check those out. I will put that information in the description of the video once we finish. And then also there's the South Carolinians for Restorative Justice organization. And that is run by a woman named Lulu Cameron, who is an activist and an organizer who recently moved to South Carolina, I believe from North Carolina. So we are excited that SC4RJ is here. Before we leave, and I'm grateful for everybody being present here tonight, one thing I want to do is share with you the next virtual book club date and time, and that is not exactly what it is. Excuse me, friends. So virtual book club for May 2023, we will be covering Lethal Injection and the False Promise of Humane Execution by Austin Surratt. Unfortunately, this is a very timely topic. It will be May 25th from 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. Go ahead and mark your calendars. This is a book that is available at most libraries. You are free to find it there, or you can purchase it wherever books are purchased. But we hope to see you there for that discussion, especially as South Carolina is poised to unfortunately pass a secrecy bill that would shield information about lethal injection drugs. Those are all of the things that I have tonight, friends. Are there any other things for the good of the whole that need to be shared before we log off?
Thank you, Stephan. Really.
Stephan, thank you for all that you do and the way you articulate it and your perseverance in this work.
And your incredible witness as well. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Keep going.
So much. I really appreciate y'all. Thank you for having me. I look
All right.
forward to the death penalty being ended in South Carolina.
Amen to that.
Please. Amen.
And with that, friends, I bid you adieu. Have a good night, and we look forward to seeing you at the next book club. Thanks.